Hello, friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast, bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. I'm here with my brother Jeremy, and we're going to talk about the book of Judges. We're going to give an overview on our crash course series through the Bible. And to start things off, Jeremy, what is Judges?
Yeah, that's a really good question because a lot of people don't know. There's a lot of scholarship about it. Um, so the book of Judges is kind of unusual because, like we said in the Pentateuch and in the Torah, most of the books in the Hebrew Bible are just titled by the first couple of words in the book, and this one is given the title Judges in Latin, Greek, and in Hebrew. Um, it gets its title from this word in Hebrew that has to do with judgment. And the word in Hebrew doesn't just mean judge like we typically think of in English or in contemporary language. We think of a judge as somebody who sits in and weighs in on like a conflict, makes a decision. That is the use of the word sometimes, but also other times it has to do with ruling and delivering and bringing people out of some sort of difficult time. And so that's more the way that the word judges is used in this part of the Bible and in this section and this storytelling. So judges are basically like local tribal rulers in the book of Judges. I think of them as I don't know, early ancient Congress people. I don't know, or
Yeah.
maybe a better way. You had a better way to say it. What
Yeah,
what were they?
I would like so I think when we hear the word judges, we're thinking about someone in a black robe with a the anvil thing going order in the court. You
Yeah,
have to think
yeah,
more like Conan the Barbarian here.
that's
Like
right.
their
Yeah,
war chieftains with like clannish structures where like they're just a mighty warrior who fights, and we're dealing with over 3,000 years ago. So it's very clannish, very warlike.
right.
Uh,
Think of Game of Thrones.
setting, but even like less structure than Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones had kingdoms. We're dealing
Yeah,
with
that's right.
clans. We're dealing with like tribes. Like
Yeah, tribes in certain territories that have settled, they have pasture, and then they have a certain individual who, when stuff gets hard, God gives them his spirit to raise them up and deliver them out of some sort of difficult time. It's also helpful to know like the Hebrew Bible is typically broken up into like early patriarchs, pre-monarchical, and then monarchical. And so this is in the pre-monarchical stage. Some people even think the reason Judges is in the Bible is to argue for the necessity of a monarchy, like it's sort of a propaganda for monarchy, which I don't necessarily think because it doesn't get any better when they get
no,
a
no, like
king.
the cycles
And
continue, just more organized and structured.
right, right. So, but it is not that clean vision of a judge as a sort of objective, person in a black robe saying, "Order, this is what we need." This is like, warlords, and
Yeah, yeah,
some of them are really rough around the edges, and so it's not necessarily a clean picture of a judge that we'd expect.
yeah, absolutely. What would you say is the like the main theme or structure of Judges?
Oh, yeah. Disaster. It's just
Yeah, chaos.
chaos, disaster, disorder. The whole book is just a wild roller coaster ride of violence, and it ends with the crescendo of the book is a civil war and sexual assault. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the end of Judges. It's a rated R book, and I have no idea why we read it as kids. We we read about like judges like what's his name, Samson and Gideon, as if they were heroes, and really they're just like tragic, terrible people that
yeah, yeah,
taken out of context can be heroes, but not when you read it in the book as a
yeah.
whole.
Yeah, even like Gideon, the 300, he was obedient to God and he was the faithful person. And then we like read about trusting God. It's not about numbers. Like
Yeah,
that's how
yeah,
Gideon
yeah,
is taught. But then like if you keep reading, he he ends up killing his own people for not fighting with him and creates an idol. Like the exact
yeah,
opposite of what we praise him for happens right afterwards. And I think like people think sometimes that like there's these closed positive arcs for every biblical character, Like if we're writing a story, you want like the redemptive arc of the character. Like Iron Man is selfish, and by the end of it, he's self-sacrificial. Like Gideon is cowardly, and then he trusts God, and then he doesn't, and then everything hits the fan. Like
Right.
that's kind of the negative downward arcs for people. And if we look at history, there's a lot of people who have tragic arcs to their life. They were maybe really good, and then they end up crappy.
Mm,
And that's why I love the Bible, because it doesn't like to tell you if it's a good ending or not. It'll just tell you that this guy actually had an epic moment of character, but also failed miserably. Like the same thing with like King Solomon. People always think that
right.
like Solomon asked for wisdom, but guess what? He wasn't really wise at the end of his life, you
Right.
know?
Right. I think that's something we miss in the Bible. I think a lot of people think the Bible is like a very neat and clean book, and there's a lot of times just really uncomfortable things. I mean, I actually think Judges is uh, a great book for our age. I mean, our generation loves sort of ironic endings and like closing things off with mystery and needing solutions, needing answers, and really, I mean, yeah, Judges does that. It concludes with a real sort of emptiness that like sort of beckons for an answer, beckons for a response. But I think that's probably like going back to the original thing of what's the theme of the book. That's it, really. I mean, it's just this. There's a common verse or a phrase that gets repeated as like a refrain throughout the book, and it's this line: "In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." So this is the judgment of the whole book, essentially saying they've forsaken Yahweh as their king. They're just really disordered and dysfunctional, and that led to, um, when we talk about like moral corruption, I think we think of just like doing wrong things, but it's like literal like death, violence,
Like breaking
injustice,
every
people who are
commandment that
innocent
was
being
written.
murdered and raped. Like that's what happens in the story when they forsake Yahweh as their king, and that's what happens when they do what's right in their own eyes. So that's sort of the trajectory of the book, and it sets you up for a redemptive figure to fix things, which will eventually be David, in his own flawed way. um, there's also a helpful way to phrase it. There's a author, a commentator, and an Old Testament scholar named Daniel Block, and he talks about Judges as being the slow Canaanization of Israel. So the book is kind of tracking with this theme of, we talked about this with Exodus into Numbers,
Mhm.
like God takes Israel out of Egypt, but it takes a long time to get Egypt out of Israel. Now they're in the land, they've been sort of planted there in Canaan, and all of a sudden they become just like Canaan. They take on Canaanite gods. They function with a morality that looks like Canaan. They have a violence and a sort of cutthroat mentality, just like Canaan, to the point where they look just like the other nations.
Yeah, and that's a common like phrase I hear, and I think with COVID and people not coming back to church, people are like, "All right, what's the point of going to church?" Or the church doesn't look any different than the culture.
Mm,
Um, I mean, I think people are like that same critique of back then, like Israel's supposed to be special, they're supposed to be different from the world. Now they
mm,
become worldly in their cultural context, so they're becoming
mm,
Canaanites.
mm.
Um, Same thing
Eh,
here. It's like you wonder, like, what this church is no different than your typical secular person.
right, right. Right, and the people who inhabit it are no different than the people. Like there's no uniqueness, which is
Yep.
really the concept of holiness in the Old and New Testament is the uniqueness of a person because they've spent time with God, with Yahweh, or with Jesus in the New Testament. So if they look no different, then what's the point? I think what's interesting. I do want to say this because I think this is really cool, is that the book concludes with that really violent scene of sexual assault and civil war in chapters 19 to 21, I believe. I
Yeah.
don't have it in front of me. Um, but the story of the sexual assault at the end is told strikingly similar to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis. In fact, I was reading that the use of verbs in that section, like a fourth of the verbs are direct copy and pastes from the Sodom and Gomorrah story. and it looks out of place because it's more ancient Hebrew. So it's as if the author is signaling like, hey, look at this story of what happened in Israel by Israelites, and it's actually exactly what happened in Genesis, but it was Israel instead of Sodomites and Gomorrites. I don't know if that's how you say that. But the point being made at the end of the book is like, at the very hands of Israelites, we're doing what we would have thought is despicable in other parts of Israel's story, and we just became, you know, the Canaanites and the Sodomites from earlier times. It's a real stunning criticism at the end of the
Yep.
book.
Yep. And it's striking. And I think that theme is so important because a lot of times people criticize the Bible, but just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean God likes this. Usually it's like these are examples not to follow. And wisdom is acquired by learning the hard way or learning from the mistakes of others.
Right.
And I think what I love about this history section of the scripture that we're reading is um, the inspired texts are written in a historical manner to pass on wisdom. Learn from
Mm.
history. If history um, history is bound to repeat unless we learn from the past. You know, like there's all those
Mm.
cliches of learning from the past are very true, and but the way that the way the history is told is a way for the listeners to make sure they're not only just knowing the history, but they're like learning what
Mm.
to not do.
Mm.
And that's
That's right.
constantly like, all right, are you worshiping God or not? This book opens up with like, remember what Joshua said at the end of Joshua, like
Right.
obey God. If you don't, things go bad. Remember what Moses said, if you don't obey God, things go bad. Remember what our ancestors said about worshiping God. If we stop doing this, things are going to get really, really, really bad.
Right.
So that's like the main theme that we're going to be carrying through as we go through the history.
Right. Right. And I think that speaks to, so we've talked about the theme, and then we talk a little bit about genre. Like, where are we now? This is a historical book, but interestingly, in the way the Hebrew Bible is sort of organized, the Hebrew Bible classifies the history books as prophetic. And so there's a sense in which this is a historical prophetic book. In other words, it's sermonic, it's ethical, it's trying to get us to see what happens when we forsake Yahweh. I mean, it's kind of like when you get to the later prophets, they talk about all the injustices that are going on and they name them and they list them, kind of like actual judges that we would think of today. And here this is like storytelling of the horrible things that happen when we forsake Yahweh. So it's different ways of telling history as a sort of inspiration to wisdom, and that's how we should read the book, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, that's a great point. The prophetic historical genre.
Yeah.
uh, uh,
It's like prophecy through storytelling, you
yeah,
know.
yeah, pointing to a greater truth through a narrate the retelling of the history.
Right. Right. So yeah, there is a structure to the book, uh and if you've ever kind of read it, you'll maybe think that it sounds a little repetitive because there's a cyclical structure to the book. There's an opening act, and then there's six judges um, that increasingly get worse and worse. And it always kind of cycles to this concept of Israel forsaking God, God saying, all right, hands off, Israel falling into some sort of oppression and being victimized by other like tribes and clans. They lose battles, something gets taken from them. Then God sort of empowers a leader from the community, from that tribe, to like rise up and fight for them. They're liberated, and then there's some short story after the liberation about how they just perpetuate the same cycle. They fall back into idolatry, and then the whole thing starts over again. So the first three stories are more like, I don't know, they're cast in a better light. The judges or the leaders are typically just kind of mentioned. Their character flaws aren't really highlighted. The last three judges, which are ones that we probably are more familiar with, so that's Gideon, Jephthah, and
Samson.
Samson. Yeah. Those three get whole stories and backstories, and the character flaws and the character traits of each of those judges get highlighted and projected, and each of them just become worse and worse. So that's what, well, yeah, that's what bothers me about how we read these stories in Sunday school is like Samson is the scum of the earth. By the time you get to him, he's the last judge in the cycle system, and he's just like the worst human being
He,
at the end of the story.
he's that annoying jock who like is annoying. Like
Yeah,
that's how he
yeah,
should be
he's the
read.
worst. He's the worst. Like he's not the hero. You don't want him to be like, yeah, you don't want him dating your daughter. He's just a terrible person.
I think that's all, the ultimate litmus test for a character is: do you want this person to date your daughter or
Yeah,
not? If the
Samson,
answer is no, then
no.
stay away.
Yeah, Samson is an easy no, and we gotta let him go. And then, as we said, after the cycle system concludes, the last two stories are stories of idolatry, sexual assault, civil war, and just straight out violence and bloodshed. Like, spoiler alert, it ends with a guy cutting a woman up into 12 different pieces and sending her body parts out to like all the different tribes of Israel. It's brutal, it's disgusting. And really, that's the end of the book. Like, the end of the book is just a letdown of like, yep, everybody's at war with each other, everybody hates each other. Like, there's evil all over the land, and help, somebody please help. That's kind of the conclusion of the book of Judges.
Exactly, exactly. Is there like a favorite part of the book you like, Jeremy? Like something that maybe gets neglected that you like to share? Or...
I don't know if it gets neglected, but one of my favorite scenes. So, okay, Judges does not, like, fair warning, it's ancient Israelite literature. Women do not typically get a really fair painting in the book of Judges. It's a patriarchal community, it's a patriarchal society. Um, it's a really, it's not a gleaming picture of women in the book of Judges. But I love that within that frame, there's this story of Deborah and Jael. I think it's in chapters 4 to 6 as their story cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that Deborah stands up as a female leader in the midst of Israel. She comes out as the hero, and men in the story get a really poor portrait painted of them throughout. And at the end of the story, Jael is the one who defeats a warlord named Sisera, and I just love like sort of the irony of the story. And I don't know, it's a pretty crazy way that she kills him.
Yeah,
She
10 peg through the head.
Yeah, she jams a tent peg through the guy's head while he's sleeping, which is pretty gruesome.
Yeah, it's
So
totally like it reminds me of the scene in Godfather with the horse. It's a gruesome scene.
yeah, gruesome scene. It's like I don't know. I just think of like Wonder Woman, Amazonian kind of like
Don't mess.
don't mess with these women. So yeah, I like that part of it because it's incredibly countercultural for Israelite literature, for a woman to be a leader, and for the woman to be the one by whose hands a powerful warlord gets executed and killed. I mean, that's pretty counterintuitive to the ancient mindset. So what do you think? What's a fun, sort of interesting favorite part of the book for you?
Yeah, there's another story of the earlier judge Ehud, right before Deborah and Barak and Jael. He's like the left-handed assassin, and he
Mm-hmm.
just like hides his dagger on his right side, so he's gonna give tribute, and it's like a scene out of an action movie. And he goes like, "I have a present for you from God," and then he stabs
Yeah.
this fat leader, and like the sword gets stuck. It's like really absurd, but it's like I could see it in an action movie, like maybe like a Quentin Tarantino movie, like.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of like that Ehud, the left-handed assassin. No one talks about him often, but I think Deborah, Gideon, and Samson pretty much take all the spotlight when people teach on judges. But
Yeah.
there's people like Ehud, the left-handed assassin, that gets left out.
Actually, you just struck a point, I think, for me. If Judges were like sort of directed by a team, I feel like Quentin Tarantino and the Coen brothers would do a great job
Yeah,
of collaborating on how Judges comes together. I feel like there's a definite like vibe from those two like directorial voices that would really put a good edge on Judges.
That is a
But
cool thing we can maybe carry for the rest of the books. Like, who do you want to direct this book of the Bible?
yeah. For this, definitely Tarantino and the Coen brothers would do a great job.
Yeah, and what they would do a good job is they'll shock us with the violence, you know,
Right,
and they don't have these very clear cut character arcs as well in their
right.
storytelling.
And there's absurdity and there's like
Irony,
irony to it. I think they would do a great job with it.
yeah.
And yeah,
So
like you said, especially with the Coen brothers, the good guy doesn't always win, right?
yeah,
And that's an important thing in Judges. Like they're, the good guys often don't win in the Book of Judges. So what about difficult, maybe uncomfortable parts that haven't been resolved for you or that just seem kind of odd in the book?
yeah. Like I mean, I mentioned Gideon earlier on. Like the fact that he like creates an idol, and uh, like that's really disturbing. Like my dad is a Gideon, like who hands out Bibles, and like he's been like the oldest like member of the Gideons. He came to this country with like nothing, but like the main ministry he did was pass out Bibles to all the hotels, and like he helped lead an initiative to like give Bibles to Armenia. And I remember like my first trip to Armenia, like there was a Gideon Bible in Armenian, like by my
That's
host
awesome.
family's bed. And I'm like, oh wow, this is like my dad's effort as a Gideon. He's like
Yeah,
this
yeah,
businessman who's just like passing out Bibles to people, and he has no idea like the impact he's had.
yeah,
And Gideon is named after like this guy who
yeah,
at the end of his character arc, he's like creating an idol. Like, what's up, Gideon? Like, remember the whole fleece thing and like
yeah,
how
yeah.
God delivered you with like
Do you
that.
know
And then you're like, you
like
create an idol and you kill your own people. Like, come on,
yeah,
man.
yeah.
Come on.
Do you know what the like history or the story is behind why they named themselves the Gideons?
I have no idea. I should,
I would love to know that. That's
I'm
interesting
going to try to
because it is
Google.
like if you read the whole story, it's like maybe don't name your organization or your movement after this guy.
Yeah. I have no idea. Maybe it's
Or
because it
I
was like
guess maybe just read the first part.
yeah,
And
exactly. Usually when
yeah,
people like do Gideons, it's a reference to like, we're small in number, but we're going to pull off something great, you know?
right.
Um,
That's funny.
So yeah, you think maybe that if I would take a guess, it's probably that, but who
Yeah,
knows? Maybe
yeah,
the founder was just named Gideon. We have no idea.
yeah. That's true. It could have nothing to do with the biblical story.
Yeah, but their symbol is like I think their symbol is connected to the story.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, but yeah, my dad's having more and more difficulties getting the Bible at hotels now. It's like I think a indication of our society shifting more secular, where it's like early on, like and early on means 30 years ago, but people were like, yeah, we'll put your Bibles in. Now
Yeah,
people are like, no, you can't do that. That's like that's
yeah,
offensive.
yeah.
I'm like, all right.
Huh. Interesting.
Anyway, there's
Interesting.
these little shifts that are interesting to be aware of.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, what about you? Anything that you kind of don't like or you find um, hard
Well,
to read?
I grappled with there's a story in the middle of it with Jephthah. He's the second major judge that they develop a character story after. Um yeah, so Jephthah's famous for a vow that he makes. He says to Yahweh, if I win this battle, I'll sacrifice my daughter as a you know, human sacrifice. Um you give me victory, I'll give my daughter basically. And a lot of people go to that text and say, hey, look, this is a sign of God's acceptance of human sacrifices early on in the Bible. So I kind of grappled with that. When I was in grad school, I did a whole term paper on Jephthah's vow. And yeah, basically, it's a really difficult text. And I think it comes down to if you read it carefully and read it with a nuanced ear, um, God is totally absent from the storyline. And Jephthah is just doing things that he thinks God wants. And basically tragically murdering his daughter because he thinks that's what God wants. And God never in the story actually says, I want this to happen. You should do this. You've made a vow. You need to keep it. It's Jephthah just not knowing Yahweh, and Jephthah deciding to do something that hurts other people when in reality God is nowhere behind what he's doing. So it's kind of a story, actually, now that I'm talking about it, it's the story about taking God's name in vain and
Yeah.
claiming to stand in the space of what God would want when God has nothing to do with what you're doing. So it's really just it's a tragic story, and I don't know that it's difficult for me on the level of like, oh, what do we do with this text? It's more like, yeah, what a sad, like, I just see a lot of today's church in that story, and it's like, I mean, obviously we're not doing child sacrifices, but that sort of, um that posture of standing in the place of like, this is what God would want, this is what we're going to do, when God is curiously absent from the scene, and not really behind what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important again to read the Bible, and people like often forget that the Bible wasn't broken out in chapters or verses,
Mm,
and it's hard to pick up that if you don't if you just jump to the text out of context,
yeah,
or without
yeah,
the big theme of this is not what to do. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? This is like
right,
he wants to be like the Canaanites who are sacrificing the the
right,
gods, it's child sacrifices, which if you read elsewhere, God's opposed to murder, opposed to such acts of human sacrifice. Um, and again, it goes back to that theme. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
yeah, yeah, and I, yeah, I just, I think that there's a there's a way of reading the Bible that doesn't sit with those nuances, and you lose so much if you don't try to read it carefully. Just because there's a story told in the Bible doesn't mean God is behind the story, in the sense that it's like instructive for us to do something in that same mode of behavior. And so, yeah, I mean, there's these stories told that are meant to be uncomfortable and dark, as a way to say, don't do that, or, you know careful with how you claim God's name. And so, yeah, that's one of them. Jephthah's vow is certainly one of those stories that sits uncomfortably. um
Yeah,
and yeah, I guess I was also just thinking, we talk about child sacrifice in the Bible as if like, oh yeah, nobody does that anymore. Who sacrifices children? But we really, if we're tracing where we get our products, sometimes, I think there's an argument to be made that sometimes we purchase things that put children in harm's way, if not, lay them in really poor socioeconomic situations. So
yeah.
it is a curious way to read the Bible, to wonder. I wonder how what I buy and how I provide,
Where are my
uh,
Nikes made? Where are my clothing made? What factory?
yeah, I
Yeah,
purchase things by these vendors. Like, how are they treating people?
yeah,
you know?
yeah. And like as someone who's pro life too, I feel like that. Yeah, I don't want to like simplify this issue, but that's another argument people make about how we just there's just way too many abortions in this country or
Mm,
worldwide. So there's that, and people can view it that way. Um, so yeah, I mean, there are things in our society that we think we're not as primitive, or this is such an ancient story, but violence and history and war are bound to repeat. We're just in that season of peace right now, hopefully, and we stay that way. I mean, but I hope war doesn't break out again. Like that's the
yeah,
cycle of Judges, where you have moments of peace, sin. All right, we need you now. All right, I'm gonna send you this guy to help you out. A little bit of peace, and then repeat.
yeah,
And that's like the cycle of human history, right? Like
yeah, yeah.
uh moments of peace, moments of war, a time for and I hate that. Like, and there's something countercultural
Mm,
with the judge that we worship, Jesus, who is the true deliverer, the true
mm,
person who liberates us and gives us actual eternal peace.
right.
And I think if we lose sight of that, you can't really preach from this book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you read Judges, all the cycles are anticipating God as king, and
Yeah.
as Christians, uh we read Jesus as the one who fills that role in that space. So if we don't read Judges with, Christ as the ultimate redeemer, judge, and king, then it leaves us in a pretty dark place.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that's the way this needs to be preached versus like, let's be strong like Samson.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. Don't be like Samson. If there's one thing you get from this episode, do not be like Samson. Do not be like Jephthah
Do
or
not be
Gideon.
like be
Be
like
like
Gideon
Jesus.
for his his faithful part, but not the I created
Yeah.
an idol part.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, and don't cherry pick the Bible. Like I think that's one of our main objectives from this whole series is to make sure we don't do that.
Yeah.
See the big picture, and the big picture will help us understand the verses when we go into detail.
Right.
So yeah, Jeremy, I think we're gonna wrap it up now.
Yeah, it
If
sounds
anyone
good.
has any comments they'd like to share, something they like to discuss, a question they may have about the Book of Judges, feel free. Thank you for all who have listened through the end of this podcast. Stay caffeinated, my friends, and God bless you. Have a great week.